to welcome us. I would like to just do a few housekeeping matters. One is, if you can please remember to, in the chat, put your name and your organization. We appreciate that, if you would please be willing to do that. And secondly, as we go through our agenda today, do know that we want to make sure that you are engaged and that you have an opportunity to ask your questions. So we would like for you to do that by raising the hand in the Zoom piece, or we'll find you if you raise your hand this way as well. But if you choose not to do that, please put your question in the chat and we'll make sure we get to that as well. So very excited that you're here. With that, Kim, if you wanted to start projecting, we'll just do a high-level walkthrough of the agenda, and then William, I will turn it over to you. It is meeting 4, and so as we go through our next slide. Today, as you can see, we're going to hear from Mandy about our LinkUS Coalition Summary Report. She'll give you details about that. You're also going to hear from Kim and Mandy about our key outcomes and discussion and what's next there. You'll have an opportunity to engage in dialogue as well. Big piece today is our funding approach and legislative amendments, something you've asked us to bring back with some details for you. That is a part of our big, robust discussion today, and you'll see a team of individuals who will be sharing that information. And then we're going to hear from Erin Prosser, who is with our Department of Development and Housing leader. She's going to talk about transit-oriented development and really lean in on some of the questions that you've asked us about how we expand and get others involved. And then finally, we'll hear back from William, who will give us our next steps and closing remarks and tell us where we go from here. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to William.
Great, thank you, Gail, and welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm William Murdock, the Executive Director at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. Our friends just call us MORPC, and one of the co-chairs of the effort here. Very excited to be with you today. You saw the agenda, and there is an intense amount of activity happening, an intense amount of progress, and having you all on this call to help hear that, to help ask questions and help get feedback is really, really critical to where this LinkUS project is going. Before I go any further though, Gail, if I can take the liberty, we have 2 members of the call who have really amazing things that have happened, and I just want to make sure we're celebrating those accomplishments. And the first one, I think she's on here, Leah Evans.
She should be, let's see.
I think she's on the call.
I'm here, William. How
I'm going to embarrass you, Leah.
Yes, you are.
Leah is the new president and CEO of Homeport, which is an amazing community institution. We've all known Leah for a long time, and this is so well-deserved, and I'm so excited for her leadership, and it frankly complements the LinkUS strategy and all of the affordable housing work. So congratulations, Leah.
Thank you, William. Humbled and honored. I thank you.
Very good, very good. And then the other one, Gail, just one more. I know we could give lots of accolades, but these 2 are pretty big. Our very own Joanna Pinkerton, I understand, is a woman of achievement with the YWCA, which is a really big darn deal and so well deserved. So Joanna, congratulations on that. We are lucky to have you in our community in such a leadership position too.
Thank you, William.
All right, well, let's dive into the project here. So as one of your co-chairs, along with Joanna Pinkerton, as well as Jennifer Gallagher at Columbus, we're excited to have you here at the 4th Steering Committee today. And thank you for caring about this. Thank you for committing to this important work. Today is a key point in our planning. And I know that you've heard from our staff about the corridor projects that are underway in terms of planning, the programmatic elements. We're aligning to previous studies. We're pulling together that community input. This is all coming together. I know that our teams have shared the community engagement efforts to date, which have been extensive. We've talked about things like priority networks. We've heard from our peer cities, and how they've approached these same types of things and how they are moving forward with implementation. This has all been very helpful, and it's important to remember this could be an inflection point for Central Ohio. We've added 250,000 people in just the last 10 years, and more than half of those are just in this area that we're looking at for LinkUS. It's really important for us to remember we are not the same community we were even 10 or 20 years ago. And so when we're thinking about approaches, when we're evaluating these solutions, we have to put our mind not just in the present, but in the future of being a growing region. And that's what's so exciting, but that's why we also need all of you to be engaged in this. When you're facing growth, the best time to plan and to invest is now. And LinkUS is coming together at this right time. But again, we really need your involvement and your leadership. So as you saw from our agenda, we've got some key outcomes today for consideration. We're going to talk about funding planning and modeling around this, and every step of the way we want to get your insights and thoughts as we move through that agenda. So make sure you're raising your hand and being able to contribute. If you could, we want you to jot down your questions and thoughts as they come to mind, so that you can ask those questions at the points when we can really take a moment to have that discussion. So we're going to have our presentations go through and then pause for an opportunity to ask those questions. So we're looking forward to this meeting today. On behalf of the co-chairs and Gail and everybody, today's a big meeting. We look forward to these recommendations, and we look forward to seeing where this goes. So at this point, we're going to start, and I'm going to turn it over to Mandy Bishop, who's going to drive that presentation. So Mandy, please go ahead. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, William. I think your remarks really gave me a great segue into talking about the Leadership Coalition report. And so I just want to kind of tee it up and provide some context. We have heard from a lot of our peer cities, and we really, we tried not to reinvent the wheel, and we really modeled our task force report, our Leadership Coalition summary report after the Charlotte model. We've talked a lot about who, why, what, and how throughout these steering committee meetings. And so our report is really structured that way. We're going to talk about who, what's the leadership coalition, who in our region is really leading the effort around these issues, and what are our expected outcomes and how are we going to measure our progress. We're going to talk about our why. We're going to highlight the 6 LinkUS priorities. We're going to talk about why we're undertaking an effort to really accommodate 1 million more people and ensure an equitable approach to that accommodation, as well as incorporate driving transportation as the backbone. We're going to talk about what is LinkUS in that report as well. We're going to define it. We're going to talk about the high capacity rapid transit. We're going to talk about transit, including fixed route and on demand. We're going to talk about the roadway, the bikeway, the pedestrian and greenways that are part of our priority networks. And then we're going to talk about the how. We're going to talk about our 6 ingredients for success. And then we're also going to share details about our funding strategy in that report. And so with that, I'd like to share a little bit about the timeline that we have for the LinkUS Coalition Summary Report as we see it today. I think we were originally on track, and we were sharing that we were working towards that report by the end of the year. And I will share that our initial draft is currently in progress and has been routed to all of our partners, the leads at each agency, specifically the city, CODA, Franklin County, and MORPC. So we're reviewing that. We're developing the draft in partnership with Kinley Horn, and we'll be continuing to develop that throughout the holidays and into the early part of the new year. We have another steering committee meeting coming up in January 18th to be exact. We will plan and schedule an executive committee meeting in late January. And around early to mid-February, we'll be sharing that report with both these 2 committees, our executive and steering committees as well. And then mid to late February, we're planning to have a final steering committee and executive committee meeting. And then we're planning to release that report in early March. And those timelines are subject to change. We want to be open to feedback from, number one, you and the executive committees and others, and be responsive and reactive to making sure that we have the report right, it has the right tone, and it shares the right message. So one of the things that, or I just want to open it up and see if there's any questions or any discussion on what I've shared about the Leadership Coalition report.
I am not seeing any at this time, Mandy.
Okay, great. So with that, I think we'll bounce to our next agenda item. Kim and I are going to share that agenda item talking about our key outcomes. But I'm going to have Kim go first. She's really been leading the effort and helping us come to kind of consensus on our measurements and our metrics.
Thanks. Acknowledging and recognizing the previous planning work that's led up to LinkUS, Next Gen, Insight 2050, Corridor Concepts, Metropolitan Transportation Plan, quite a few other documents have, in the way of analysis and public engagement, really led a path for how do we define success? How do we measure success? And it's really utilizing a lot of this work already established to inform the LinkUS key outcomes. And by doing this, we really ensure a regional scope, and we emphasize the potential return on investment for the infrastructure investment that we're talking about. So with that, our team took some time to really analyze these previous planning documents, really lining them up and understanding how they fit within the 6 priorities of LinkUS: the workforce development, sustainability, innovation, affordable housing, and I know I'm going to forget a couple more: mobility, connections. So with that, we have established 7 key outcomes as a beginning, as a start, and with the accompanying metrics. And the page that was attached to your agenda really helps connect what the key outcomes are we're suggesting, as well as the metric that goes along with it, where that metric comes from, and then within that document that it comes from, whether it's corridor concepts or if it's from the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, you can go to those documents and then be able to see the analysis, the data behind the work, the engagement, the discussion that went with that. So it's really a holistic package. With that, I'm not going to go through these one by one, just pointing out that we realize there needs to be goals that we're working towards, that LinkUS is an easy way to communicate and demonstrate of why this is good for our community, what it brings back to our community, and then it's connecting a lot of our goals in the community, such as workforce development, et cetera. And for each of these, this metric can help establish that communication link with our larger community. So with that, for example, I'm going to point out mode share. Currently, LinkUS will lessen our region's share of and need for single occupancy vehicles by focusing transit-oriented development around a series of mobility-rich communities and transit stop locations. These corridors will produce, I think we're missing a metric there at the end, but the corridors will produce a lot more people. It's an easier choice. It's an easier choice to utilize transit and to walk and bike to get to where you want to go. Therefore, we know currently from our State of Mobility report and MORPC's annual metrics that they put out for the community, about 3.5% of our community utilizes transit for commuting. Therefore, if we watch that go up over time and we connect it back to the land use decisions and development patterns, we really see connections. So with that, I'm going to stop, see if there's any questions. And I think Mandy's going to talk about next steps regarding key outcomes.
Sure. So we can also take questions after I speak. So thank you, Kim, for giving that context, and really thank you for helping kind of bring these key results to the forefront and put them present and get them out before the steering and then ultimately the executive committee. And I know for a lot of you, you'll see these key outcomes and you'll say, well, that's very obvious. Those are very obvious results. And that's one of the conversations that we've been having among MORPC, the city, Franklin County, and CODA is what level of specificity is correct for the Leadership Coalition report. And we really feel like preparing to build on the work that's been done in the region is the right first step. And so next steps, I've already sat down with Maria Schaefer this morning, and she really helped educate me more on the MTP and the metrics and the data that is being generated as part of that. She helped, I've learned more about corridor concepts and how our regional growth is really concentrated in those corridors, not necessarily 100% aligning with LinkUS. And so her and I are continuing conversations, and we'll bring in our other partners in order to determine how are we going to build metrics that help us really define what LinkUS is going to do for our region as we enter our next phase of work as we continue this work, and then also enter our next phase of work in next year. So those are kind of next steps for us, is really to develop some specificity as we bring more definition to the program that comes out of the priority networks. And so I'll just open it up to everybody for questions on this topic.
And so if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands. It may be ideal, Kim, if you wanted to just walk through some of those outcomes one more time, help people see exactly what they are. I know they had a chance to share and see them in advance, but let's just walk them through them just one more time. So as we're looking at them, they may be able to ask questions even later in our work today, but we have a little time. So I just think walking through those a little more deliberately might be helpful, if you're willing to do so.
Gail, I had my hand up. Can I ask a question, part of the same thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Kim, I totally agree. Thank you for putting this thing back on the screen, because we switched after number 5. We can barely see what was after it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have one suggestion, and I think that will be helpful later. We are going to find out for what Mandy is trying to do, is that we need to convert those things into how they contribute to the people's well-being. Like, for example, if our commute time goes down, we can spend more time with our families. People spending more time with their families create a happier communities. You know, if you commute, if the transportation is faster, or get rid of cars and we use more common transit, we put less carbon in the air, and that improves the upper respiratory illnesses in the community, and basically the health improves. If we go to the backways and the roads, then the infrastructure expenditures of the municipalities goes down, and that reduces the pressure on the taxes. My point is, I mean, these are all very intellectual analysis, and I don't remember 5, 6, 7, 8, which is the next slide, but every one of them have to be translated into how it improves health, how it improves family life, how it saves energy, how it saves taxes, how it improves air quality and things like that. Maybe I'm not at the right place here to say those things, but the outcomes are not to please engineers or intellectuals. The outcomes have to be things that touch people's lives that they can relate to. I mean, that's what I want to,
Thank you for that. Just as we are sharing this, making sure that we're always focused on the benefits to people, how it impacts the lives of our residents. Is that what we're hearing, Yarmir, making sure that we align that in a way that—
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's what I want to say. And frankly, I have not seen 6 or 7. We went through it very quick. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the bottom one says taxes are going down, you know, and infrastructure costs are going down. I mean, that's, people can relate to it, you know, and we need to bring everything. I mean, you know, sometimes some of you know that I use the well-being index of Gallup, which has 5 pillars that improves people's happiness, that is measuring happiness. Every one of those things should be converted in language who shows how we contribute to the happiness of the people, either helping their financial health, their physical health, their mental health, their fiscal health. I mean, they are basically 5 pillars, and that is what we need to communicate, because then that becomes easy to explain. You know, if you tell someone, you know, there's an engineering term about the miles driven per year go down by X billion miles. Okay, what does that mean for me? You know, and nothing. But if you tell me that reduce the carbon improves my health, and I can spend more time with my children, I relate to it. You know, and I mean, I think we need to bring things to the people's level. I mean, enough said. I would like other people to comment as well.
Thank you so much. And Barbara, I see your question regarding number 7. And Kathy, I do see your raised hand. Barbara, definition of disadvantage of communities of interest is that terminology. Kim, if you wanted to share anything additional around that, but communities of interest.
I'm happy to. So in a lot of the earlier studies, it's using the demographic data to understand the level of investment in various communities and various outcomes. And it's just as we work on how LinkUS contributes to a more equitable community, equitable opportunities, we truly want to understand what some people define as communities of interest. And I believe that's the terminology we're using for the demographic.
3. Yeah, I think it was on number 3.
3, I'll go back one. And I apologize, my back arrow is whatever. So number 3, LinkUS will provide faster, is that the one?
It's
Barbara?
the metric, average travel time for disadvantaged population within 5%. And I mean, that could have a lot of meaning. I just wanted some help there.
I can answer that, and we probably need to use different terminology, so there aren't so many questions. Looking at the amount of time people use to commute to work, those, especially without a car, getting to a job, and many times an hourly job, spend a lot more time commuting to work than those with other choices, with choices of how they travel. And so it's really looking at how do you bring an equilibrium of how long it takes to get to work or to school to the community overall.
So someone just added that that's the terminology used in the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. I just reflected on it because we've done a series of listening sessions at Huntington across our 12 states with community groups. And there's been a lot of feedback to us not to use the term disadvantaged, but to use communities of interest, to use under-resourced. Now, if this is a technical definition in the sphere of transportation and mobility, that might be a different piece. But I think towards Yarmer's point, if ultimately we're leading towards something that the public can understand, that they can buy into as far as what they're investing in, ultimately, I think the language and the clarity of it will matter, which I think we've all said before too. And you're getting there.
Thank you so much for that. Kathy, I think you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you for recognizing me. So if you move to the next screen with the goals 5 through 7, the next slide, there's a couple of things here that don't match the climate action plan that was just released. So in the climate action plan, I think the mode shift from number 5 is by 2050. I have the climate action plan here on a different, or reducing single occupant vehicle miles traveled is 40% by 2050 instead of, let's see, yeah, I guess that would move in with number 5. If there's 40%, I guess I want to check this against the climate action plan because reducing vehicle miles traveled is 40%. And then moving vehicles, registered vehicles, including transit vehicles, to alternative fuel by 2050 is 100% instead of just 40%. So I guess I would urge you all to, really align the goals of this with the climate action plan goals, which are for the most part very strong. And then also one of the I guess ways of measuring this should be carbon emissions. How much are we reducing carbon emissions? Because the climate action plan is calling for a 45% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, or I'm sorry, by 2030. So just in the next, 8 years, we have committed, the city is committed to reducing carbon emissions 45%, which is a lot. And LinkUS is part of the climate action plan. It is in there. But these goals, that needs to funnel down to the goals so that everything is aligned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could, just a couple of points of clarification. First of all, Kathy, thank you. And I'm so proud of the fact that you have the city's climate action plan open in front of you. That is way cool. That is focused on the city. A lot of the things out of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan just is regional in scope. So sometimes the scope is different. And actually I'm smiling because that first item regarding the math, a 40% reduction in single occupancy vehicle. Actually, there is an equation we're working on with MORPC to help us understand 10% of commuters using transit would actually be even a lot more reduction of single occupancy vehicle, but we're trying to understand that equation, and it's just how we measure it. The reason we pulled this one from the Metropolitan Transportation Plan is mode share is how cities across the region measure how many people are using single occupancy vehicles and how many people are using other modes. So that 40% reduction of single occupancy vehicle needs to equate into a mode share percentage goal, because that allows us to measure against other cities. But I really appreciated the points from the other ones, and we'll definitely look at aligning those, or at least communicating them and how they're lined up. Thank you.
Great. We have time for 2 more questions, and I know Sandy has her hand up. Sandy?
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, everybody. You know, my comment is actually similar to Kathy's, but I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. And it's really just something I'm asking everybody on the committee to keep in mind as we go forward. The thing I've learned about living in Columbus the last 30 years is this is probably the most incredibly well-meaning community ever on the planet. The worry I have, though, is that we've got to find ways for all of the plans we have in the community, whether it's the Franklin County Rise Together plan, whether it's the Mayor's Economic Resiliency and Recovery Initiative, whether, I mean, there's a bunch of initiatives, MORPC's regional housing strategy, et cetera. I would love if we could find ways to continue to talk about these things together. So LinkUS is an incredible thing in and of itself, but when you also really dig into these outcomes, there's a lot of overlap here with some other really well-meaning plans. So it would be great if, not to put the burden on the LinkUS committee alone, I think other committees involved in other pieces and parts of these various plans for the region need to do the same thing. But I'd love us to continue to look for, talk about, and even put in writing where these plans intersect with each other and how they support one another. I think a lot of us on this call are in a lot of rooms where these plans are talked about. And if we're all cohesively able to say that these plans all support each other, I think there's a huge benefit to come from the public recognizing that we're actually advancing multiple initiatives at the same time by looking for those intersections. So I'll just throw that out there. Maybe in the future, we can start to think about how some of that might work.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then Andrew, I thought I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so I'll just buttress what Sandy just put in place as far as the Rise Together plan from the county's perspective. I think for us, from an investment standpoint, we are always looking for alignment throughout the community, and that's one of the major strategies of the Rise Together plan as we, put both resources, physical and financial resources into place for those sorts of goals. My question was a little bit less nuanced. It was just more about the goal of the 10% commuters using transit, bike, or walk. What is this number, sort of strategic number, based on? How many people in practice would that look like in 2050, since we're looking at possibly adding 1 million more people to our community by 2050? And then what, in terms, I think I'm trying to think of this from a physical aspect, like what in terms of cars and traffic does 10% of our 2050 population look like? And is that going to be ambitious enough for us to, should we rethink that to more like 20%? And why not? Or why? Or what are some of the thoughts for and against that?
Andrew, thank you for that. Thank you for the input. And I think Kim and I want to be a little bit clear. These metrics are metrics that are definitely already in place. And so one of the next steps that we really need to think of before we set ambitious or moonshot or even goals that we are really confident that we can meet, is we really need to know what our evaluation strategy is going to be. And we need to know, we've established the priority networks, which is really the range of possibility of the transportation investments. We also know that there's a development component that's really going to drive what that looks like. So in the next, 3 to 6 months, I'm hoping really early next year, we have a metric strategy, and then we'll be executing that metric strategy so that we can actually answer the questions that you just posed.
Right. So what you're saying is, like, what I would love to see sort of as we're mapping this out in the future is, like, if we followed through with the plan as we agree upon it, and we get everything that we want, what's the capacity of those transit corridors versus what percentage of our community is moving in that direction?
Excellent. So I'm sure we'll have more for you, Andrew, as we come back in January, and as Mandy said, work through those metrics. Thank you for that. If you have any other questions on this piece, please jot them down and we will get back to you. We want to make sure that we get to our funding approach discussion, because we know that's something you've asked for us to bring back to you, and I'm sure you have many questions around that. So Rory, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick off this portion of our discussion.
Thanks so much, Gail, and glad to see everybody today. To begin our funding approach discussion, I wanted to recap what we presented in our last steering committee meeting. Terry Fogler provided insight on how our current mobility systems are funded, which you'll see again on the next slide, and how CODA and most state transit systems are largely funded, which is through the Regional Transit Authority, or RTA, sales tax. On this slide, you see a recap of the current RTA tax rates within the CODA service area, and then the maximum that it can increase from its current rate. Terry also gave an overview of the existing CODA revenues and budget, of which the RTA sales tax is nearly 75%. Next, I presented that we believe that the RTA sales tax is a key funding vehicle for LinkUS. Since there's additional capacity, it could generate significant funding and generate revenue from the entire CODA service area. It's also a local sustainable revenue source that can be leveraged and utilized as a local match. And lastly, I gave an overview of how the Southwest Ohio Regional Transit Authority, also known as SORTA, and Hamilton County were able to amend the Ohio Revised Code to allow for their RTA sales tax to be used for transit as well as for transit supportive infrastructure purposes. Next slide. Here's how our current mobility system is funded by each priority network. We have and will continue to pursue any available funding sources to advance LinkUS. Through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we believe that there'll be significant additional transportation infrastructure dollars available to our region over the next 5 years. And it's not just on the transportation side, but also on the housing side as well. So there's tremendous opportunities both on the transportation and housing side to really help advance LinkUS forward. The LinkUS partners are working to determine how much of the IIJA will impact the LinkUS financial model and help us reach our key outcomes. However, no matter what federal grants, state grants, and bonding capacity we consider, a sustainable local match must be established for any of these improvements to move forward. And that's why a change to the RTA sales tax is necessary. Next slide. Today, Angel Muma, Chief Financial Officer from CODA, is going to give us more insight into how the LinkUS financial model is being constructed. Then we'll begin to explore some key near-term funding considerations for us to consider as we draft the LinkUS Coalition report. And some of those main questions that we'll be talking about today are, how much should the RTA sales tax change? Should that sales tax be permanent or temporary? What are the costs of a prioritized LinkUS mobility program? How should the new RTA sales tax revenue be allocated for transit and transit supportive infrastructure? And how should LinkUS infrastructure funds be administered? We'll go into more of that as we move through the presentation. And Angel, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you, members of the steering committee. It's a pleasure to be with each of you this afternoon. So as you know, there are different mobility networks contemplated within the LinkUS program, including bicycle ways, pedestrian ways, greenways, roadways, high capacity rapid transit, and other transit investments. The preliminary cost of this network is an estimated $19 to $22 billion. The financial modeling CODA and the LinkUS partners, along with our partners at AECOM, Kimley Horn, and PFM, initially is focused on the high capacity rapid transit piece and the other transit investments. So basically the first two components on the top row that you see there. These two components, and Kim, if you could go on to the next slide, make up the majority of the total network costs at an estimated $14 billion, or approximately 64% of the overall project as a whole. In addition to the high capacity rapid transit corridors, an estimated cost of $5 billion makes up the other transit investments. And that category can be broken down into 4 areas: service improvements, capital improvements, technology improvements, and programs, policy, and partnerships. And the total of those 4 components round out the remaining $9 billion. We know even going up to the full transit sales tax of 1%, so adding that additional 0.5%, there will not be sufficient funding for this entire program, let alone the other transit supportive program elements. As such, our team is prioritizing the projects based on those items that you see on the right-hand side. Kim, could you go back one for me? Those items are the high capacity rapid transit corridors that will encourage transit supportive development, expanding our fixed route and on-demand services in order to connect people to places, electrification of our fleet, which will reduce CODA's environmental impacts, mobility programs and partnerships that are customer focused and focus on increasing our ridership. And finally, those technological and capital investments that will improve our service reliability, speed, and safety. While each of the project components identified within the $14 billion of unconstrained projects are important, the prioritization really should be tied to the objectives and key metrics that were initially discussed about just moments ago with the team and is further defined by this group and as LinkUS progresses. Kim, our next slide will show that our initial financial model is being built around various revenue streams at the federal, state, and local levels. Now, this list in front of you right now is not intended to be all-encompassing. It's rather provided to provide a level of confidence that we are looking into any and all revenue sources on top of the transit sales tax to fund this very important program. On the cost side of things, which is our next slide, as I previously mentioned, the transit costs alone are estimated at $14 billion. In addition to the nearly $5 billion for the 8 high capacity transit corridors, there is a projected average annual cost in the unconstrained model of about $32.3 million. This level of spend requires well over twice the level of local funding that would be generated by the largest allowable RTA sales tax increase of a 0.5%. So using the cost estimates provided by AECOM and Kimley Horn, the PFM team is modeling different scenarios for the transit-related improvements. The first scenario is what I would refer to as the baseline, and it's a completely unconstrained model with the full $14 billion of improvements in it. Running this model was really important because it allowed us to understand what could and couldn't be done. And the end result of that model, as I've already highlighted, is that even considering significant grant revenue and the maximum allowed increase in the transit sales tax, it's not financially achievable. From there, then, the team is now developing different cost scenarios that contemplate different levels of investment in different operating components with the goal of getting to a viable transit program. This is important for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we are required by the FTA to show a long-term, which is 20+ years, financial model that is affordable. We have to be able to prove that we can do it from a financial standpoint. Second, is we consider an ask from the community for an increase in the transit sales tax in support of LinkUS. It is really important that we have a clear understanding of what we're proposing to that community in terms of capital investment, service offerings, and operational improvements. The last scenario that we're running is the possibility of allocating a portion of that new transit sales tax for other transit supportive mobility infrastructure. To the extent that that occurs, that means additional prioritization will need to be done on the transit pieces, as there will be less dollars to fund those improvements. It's our understanding that the City of Columbus, along with MORPC, is working on the transit supported costs that we will then incorporate into the model. When this is all said and done, it is our goal to get a comprehensive LinkUS mobility implementation plan that is desirable by the community, achieves the desired outcomes that have been identified, and is affordable. The model and this process is really iterative, and the model itself is built on pulling different levers. So it's really interactive and fun to play with. But while it sounds simplistic, there are considerations that need to be taken into account when we're doing trade-offs. For example, there is a rational bundling of services. There are complicated operational and capital components that go together, in which timing is important. There are some projects that lend itself to debt financing, while others are pay as you go. So it's not simply a let's cut this out in order to get this amount of savings. It really is different scenarios play out different outcomes in terms of the financial model. So this modeling at the end of the day is really not a quick removal of one service or one component of the project to see if it all balances out. As you'll see on this next slide, this illustrates the different types of trade-offs we're looking at as a result of the financial constraints that we have. So reducing the number of corridors and adjusting each of the other areas in order to achieve a fiscally achievable and doable model. While we are evaluating many of the revenue sources, as many as possible, this committee has already heard that the expansion of the transit sales tax is the most realistic funding stream available to provide meaningful revenue in support of LinkUS. Based on our, Kim, can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Based on our current sales tax receipts in 2021, we would expect that an additional 0.5% would generate about $150 million annually. Our current 0.5%, which again is made up of a 0.25% permanent tax and another 0.25% that is renewable every 10 years, with the next renewal coming in 2026, today funds both our operating budget as well as a piece of our capital, but not at a sustainable level. And this is a really important point because CODA's board tomorrow is going to consider a 2022 operating budget in which our expenditures are expected to exceed our revenue by over $30 million, necessitating our dipping into reserves to continue providing services to the community. Based on the modeling thus far, we will need the full 0.5% sales tax increase, the maximum amount allowed by Ohio Revised Code, to fund a reasonable transit system growth like we see in cities of comparable size, and some appropriate amount of other transit supportive infrastructure. The certainty of this revenue stream is very important. The financial model assumes the utilization of debt or long-term financing to fund many of the infrastructure improvements and capital investments. Debt requires certainty. So to the extent that CODA's additional transit tax is temporary in nature, our ability to leverage those dollars for meaningful investment is certainly limited. Kim, next slide. So as this group considers a LinkUS funding strategy centered around a transit sales tax increase, the following points are important. Again, CODA currently has a 0.5% in place. An increase up to our statutory limit of 1%, which would be an additional 0.5%, would raise the total sales tax rate for Franklin County to 8%, which would tie us with Cuyahoga County for the highest in the state of Ohio. They are also at 8%. The statutory limits imposed by Ohio Revised Code limit the amount that we can go to the voters for in terms of a transit sales tax at 1%. So what this means to CODA is that we have no other ability to go back to the voters to ask for additional dollars for operating or capital improvements in the foreseeable future unless something were to change with Ohio Revised Code. Knowing we have not engaged the community with any polling or formal survey work on this issue, we'd like to open up here in a little bit some questions to this group. The first is, how would you assess the region's willingness to support a sales tax of up to 0.5% to implement LinkUS? What do you see as the major impediments or obstacles in securing such an increase? And finally, what are your thoughts in seeking a temporary versus permanent tax authorization? While you ponder these questions, I want to turn the presentation over to Greg Daniels, who is a partner at Squire Patton Boggs, and Bill Byers from Byers Minton and Associates. Our plan, as I've laid out to you today, requires some legislative changes to Ohio Revised Code. And Greg has been working with our team to help craft language that can be considered by our state legislature. And he's going to walk through those proposed amendments. And then Bill has helped us start the process to get that information in the hands of legislators. Once the two of them have concluded their presentation, we'll revisit the questions that I've just left you with. Greg?
Thanks, Angel. Good afternoon, everyone. Kim, yes, that's perfect. So again, my name is Greg Daniels. I'm with Squire Patton Boggs, and I've been working with the LinkUS team on a series of legislative amendments that are designed to enable CODA to implement the LinkUS initiative. I'm going to run quickly through what these amendments entail. And part of the reason for going over these amendments is, as Bill will address, community support, business support will likely end up being important to ultimately get these amendments through the General Assembly. So starting with the first set of amendments, this is a modernization, an update to the definition of transit facilities in CODA's enabling statute. Transit facilities, for the most part, entail the entire scope of what CODA can engage in. So it's very important that the definition of transit facility is broad enough to encompass the LinkUS initiative. So as we set about this initiative, we looked at the statute and identified areas to modernize the statute. Just for some context, the statute was put in place in 1970. It has been largely unchanged since then. Needless to say, transit has changed a lot in the last 50 years and is going to change even more. So in terms of what is a transit facility, there are three main changes that we are seeking with the amendments to the legislation. First, we want the ability to improve the rights of way along the BRT or LRT corridors. This not only includes putting in place the infrastructure for the BRT or LRT lines themselves, which we can already do, those are transit facilities, but also improve the broader right-of-way area to help accommodate those BRT and LRT lines. This includes everything from curbs, improving other lanes of traffic, to utilities, and very importantly, smart communications infrastructure to help optimize the traffic systems and the BRT and the LRT systems. Second, we want to expand the definition of transit facilities to include anything we can get money for from the federal government or the state government. Again, the statute was put in place in the 70s. The scope of federal funding and state funding has changed a lot since then. We want to fully take advantage of possible federal and state grants. And finally, the entire current statute is designed around mass movement and regularly scheduled transportation. We want to expand that to include demand responsive transportation, really addressing some of the first and last mile transportation needs. There are some pilot programs that CODA can do and has been doing under the current statute. We want to really expand that ability to address these first and last mile transportation needs. Kim, if you can go to the next slide, please. The next set of statutory amendments, this is an amendment to the SORTA statute that you heard Rory refer to. 3 or 4 years ago, SORTA had a special statute put in place that allowed it to implement some transit supportive infrastructure. In SORTA's case, that was constrained to roads and bridges that were not transit facilities, but supported the transit facilities that SORTA was engaged in. The way that statute was drafted is it applied only to Hamilton County. So the first amendment we are seeking is to expand it to Cuyahoga County and to Franklin County so we can take advantage of the program. The second change is we are seeking to expand what transit supportive infrastructure is beyond roads and bridges to the greenways, pathways, bikeways, and pedestrian improvements that we have been talking about. Finally, under the SORTA statute, the Public Works Commission in Hamilton County played a coordinating and oversight role. As Rory alluded to, there will need to be systems in place to provide the administration and oversight for the use of the CODA tax dollars that will go to these transit supportive facilities. Our vision is to broaden the statute to enable MORPC to play that role, because MORPC has a multi-county jurisdiction, whereas the Franklin County Public Works Commission is just Franklin County. The thought is MORPC is a more appropriate coordinating body in our case. Kim, if you can move to the next slide. So there are 2 other amendments that I'll run through quickly here. One is to the ability of CODA to acquire real property. Again, right now, CODA has the ability to acquire real property for transit facilities. The statutory amendments expand that ability to allow real property acquisition for transit-oriented development. So some examples this group may have talked about before, but some examples include daycare facilities, grocery, medical care, housing, clustered around transit stations and transit lines. Critically, CODA could have now the ability to assemble this property, be the aggregator of the property to enable this transit-oriented development. The statutory amendments do not envision or give CODA the power to actually develop the property. That would be done by other public or private entities that partner with CODA, but CODA could aggregate the property. The final amendment we're seeking, Angel alluded to, if the program is fully implemented, there will need to be a significant amount of bond financing. Right now, CODA has limited ability to issue bonds backed by CODA sales taxes. The amendments would permit an expansion of that for CODA to issue bonds that are backed by its own sales taxes. So Kim, I think we can move on for some commentary from Bill.
Great. Thanks, Greg, and good to be with all of you. Greg did a nice job, as always, of comprehensively covering what the amendment would do. I'm going to speak just for a moment on process. So as Greg alluded, we took Greg's draft, got it formally drafted by the Legislative Service Commission. We've been having conversations with, in particular, Senate leadership and Senator Stephanie Kunze from the region here, who also happens to be the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, quite convenient. Our goal, if we think about potential timelines, really we have to have this passed, given the 90-day effective date, on or around sort of the April-May timeframe, and that's important for the legislative calendar as well. The legislature, the Senate is done this week. The House was done last week. They won't be back until the week of January 19th, and then they'll be here for the most part until June 30th, or at least mid-June. They will take a slight break for the primary in May and then come back and wrap things up. So our window is quite narrow. And what we are looking to do at this point is to try to shortcut the process a bit, rather than introducing this as a freestanding piece of legislation, to identify a vehicle that's already passed one chamber or the other, where this language could be amended into it. And so when that chamber passes it, it only has to go to the other chamber for a simple concurrence vote on the floor. So rather than having to go through two committee processes and the like, that's how we would get this done. Importantly, as Greg mentioned, this is really a modernization amendment. It's really recognizing the changes that have happened in the way that public-public and public-private partnerships work, the way that transit now works, and it in no way, shape, or form adjusts or changes our ability to levy taxes, to go to the ballot. It's simply how we can spend the money, the types of arrangements we can have, et cetera. And that's important because those of you that follow along directly or tangentially, this is a very challenging environment right now. And so anything that sort of smacks of a tax increase or the like instantly draws additional folks, even outside of our region, that are opponents. So we're trying to keep this framed in the context of really a modernization amendment, that they've already done this for SORTA. This allows our region to meet its needs without really any additional needs from the General Assembly other than this law change. Our ask is going to be, as we proceed ahead, we're going to try to collect as many individual businesses, business organizations, civic groups to sign on collectively to a letter that Patrick Harris and his team and Stephen Sayer at the city and their team are working on to try to show large community support for this change. That's important because when we had a similar type of change, albeit different, up in the Toledo region, President Huffman commented that it was the only thing that the Toledo Chamber and the business community had asked him for in all his years in the legislature. So that's the nature in which we're proceeding with this. And with that, I'll stop and happy to answer any questions.
So Bill, this is Bob Bitzenhofer from CMHA. We pursued a similar kind of path with modernizing our housing authority laws a few years ago. This sounds like exactly the same path that we went down, and we were successful in expanding and come some in kind of the similar ways that you're looking at here. So happy to share our notes, I guess, from how we did ours or talk to you about it. But same with CMHA is similar to CODA, where our statutes are pretty arcane and still stuck in the 50s, and we were trying to do work that is much more 21st century focused with partners and everything. So, and then the General Assembly gave us that flexibility.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it, and we certainly will reach out. For those of you that know, I also work with Columbus State Community College, and that was a bit of a different effort in that we actually had to expand our taxing authority. But typically, and I'm hesitant to even say this given the current environment, typically the legislature, when they are not the ones that are raising taxes or doing something to somebody, and it's a self-determination play by a community, they've been willing to accept these types of changes. And the benefit here, of course, again, is that we're not actually adjusting our taxing authority. It's just how we can spend money, the types of partnerships we can have. I see Barbara's hand is up there.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Greg. Very thoughtful work and great process you've outlined. Could you speak a little bit on maybe it was slides 1 and 3 about the scope of these amendments? How one of them you were very clear that would just be an extension into Columbus and I think you said since Cleveland. But as far as the others reference CODA specifically, does the amendment say CODA or is it any entity like RTA in Dayton? And then how much of the other authority to spend or modernizations apply statewide, or is this very narrow?
Greg, you want to take that?
Yeah, happy to take that. And Kim, maybe if you can flip back to slide 25, the first legislative slide. I can highlight those a little bit. While we're doing that, it breaks down into two categories. There are general changes to the definition of transit facility. Those apply statewide to any RTA. The second set of changes is for this transit supportive infrastructure that's accomplished through that Rta statute that was put in place 4 or 5 years ago. That is specific to RTAs currently, with just one RTA currently, that's Rta in Hamilton County. Part of our amendments will expand that to include Franklin County, so COTA and anything in the COTA service area. And because they set it by population, Cuyahoga County's population is between that of Hamilton County and Franklin's County, so they get swept into it as well. So they're along for the ride. They get the bonus authority here. So it would just apply to those 3 RTAs.
Importantly,
So
Barbara, I'm sorry, go ahead, Greg, if you have more.
Go ahead, Bill.
Importantly, Barbara, we've already started the conversations with the Ohio Public Transit Association, of which we are a member. My good friend, Matt Carl, is the executive director and the government affairs representative, and Patrick Harris from COTA was just on their board call today. So they've seen the language, they're having the conversation. Their plan is to vote, hopefully to support that in their January board meeting. And then we would actually have Opta working side by side with us and Matt working with us to support that. So they're well aware that the provisions that would be generally applicable to all transit authorities, and then Cleveland RTA is aware that just by the nature of the way we do these population definitions, they're also going to have this additional flexibility that we would have and that Southwest Ohio would have.
Yep. And so just again, quickly by way of review here, this particular slide is for the general authorizations apply to all RTAs to expand the definition and modernize the definition of transit facilities in these 3 categories. Enhance.
You froze, Greg.
Did we lose him? Yes, he did. There he is. We lost you for a moment, Greg. We lost you for a moment.
I'm sorry, can you folks hear me again?
We can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Not sure what all you heard, but what I was saying is the 3 categories again are expansion of authority to do work along BRT and LRT corridors that are not directly on the BRT or the LRT lines, including utilities and smart communications infrastructure. The ability to take advantage of the full slate of federal and state grants, and also expand demand responsive transportation. So that, again, this is the list that would apply to any RTAs across the state. Still very transit facility focused, but really modernizes and matches what other cities are doing with their transit facilities. And then Kim, if you could skip ahead 2 slides, or just 1 slide actually, to the Rta statute slide, sorry. Go back 1 to the 353 slide. This is the transit supportive facility statute that Rta has. It includes roads and bridges that are not directly adjacent to LRT and BRT lines. We are expanding it to include greenways, pathways, bikeways, and pedestrian improvements that this group and other groups have talked about. That's not currently part of the statutory authorization, but it's obviously a critical component that we want here. And then the other major change is allowing MORPC to be the oversight group. Currently, it's just the Public Works Commission. Again, we think MORPC is more appropriate. And go ahead.
No, thank you. If does that answer your question, Barbara? And we do have a couple of other questions as
Very
well.
thoroughly. Thank you. And thanks for the thoughtful work.
Thank you. And we have a question from Josh in our chat, wants to get a better understanding of what transit supportive means. As we're talking about our budget, Angel, as you were walking through your presentation, and he just wants to make sure that, we talked about roadways in some previous conversations, and wants to make sure that we're very deliberate in what we mean by that. Because we want to make sure that it's all inclusive and not just the roadways. So, Angel?
This is Terry.
Sure, I mean, I think, oh, go ahead, Terry.
Right. We were emailed back and forth to compare notes here. But in effect, I think it's, and Greg can expand on it for us, but the statutory intent obviously want to make the nexus between the transit system itself and this related infrastructure. So in Cincinnati, they have some criteria about the geography from transit lines and such that relate to the roads and bridges. And the idea is that the sidewalks and the bike paths and the greenways, you'd want to find some type of nexus on that shows the mobility connections and the support for getting people to and from those larger systems. Greg, you may have something more on that related to if there's anything statutorily that's suggested by definitions elsewhere or something on that, but that's my understanding.
Well, and if I could just add too, I think that one of the goals in these amendments is to get it right one time. Your point is very well taken about how roadways could be counterintuitive to what the overall goals of LinkUS are. We want to make sure we don't shoot ourselves in the foot by not being as broad as we need to be when we're looking at these amendments to the legislation.
Yeah, I totally understand that. This is Josh who asked the question. I mean, my real concern is just looking at the MTP, there's billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in there about arterial roads and freeway expansion. And, and transit funding is, this much compared to this much of roadway funding. And if folks swoop in and decide, well, let's just use all this funding to expand Broad Street because we have bus shelters there, that doesn't, we're essentially giving ourselves the ability to do that. And I would just like more specificity that that's not the intention. And I have the same question about smart communication infrastructure, because again, ODOT just spent $50 million to put signs on 670 and actually took away the ability of CODA to use the shoulder there by doing so. So it would be important for me to see that there were some kind of assurances that this money wasn't just going to go to the same issues that we're trying to address with LinkUS, rather than doing road widening. And if you look at the roadways that are identified, a lot of those are suburban arterials. So again, just concerned that we have a very limited amount of money. Even while we're asking for additional money, $150 million a year is nowhere near the amount that is being spent on roadways in Central Ohio per year. So just want to make sure that we are keeping this for transit and sustainable transportation, not just increasing the level of service for single occupancy vehicles on our wide arterials.
Terry, maybe I can, and Angel, just in terms of the statute, in terms of these transit supportive infrastructure, the statutory amendments are specific, and the existing statute is specific, that it has to relate to the provision of services by CODA. So we always have to have that supportive nexus between what we're doing with the transit supportive infrastructure and the provision of services. And Terry and Angel can speak more directly to the plans for spending the money. And just again, by way of reminder, these are CODA sales taxes or would be CODA sales taxes. Ultimately, they need to support CODA's mission and purpose. So, but Terry, Angel, you can speak a little bit more directly about the planned uses here.
I think this is part of what Rory was referring to earlier in terms of how this stuff gets administered, how the plans get created. I think been very good discussion between the city and MORPC and CODA about how we take all this data from the analysis that we have done. with regard to sidewalks and bike paths. And there could be some roadways that are just, I mean, when you think about the high capacity BRT systems, they are radically, some of the biggest parts of the costs are what they're doing to roadways on there to get this dedicated lane in there. So it could be massive roadway improvements to create a dedicated lane for a transit vehicle going forward. But I think the notion that we've talked about, and I think what will come increasingly before this group, is creating some kind of process that actually goes forward to MORPC that kind of ties together all of these supportive infrastructure projects in a rational way and links them and connects those to the planning and scheduling and timing of those transit improvements that are taking place as well on that front. And I think going through the process, that's one reason that MORPC was so attractive, because a lot of these things are already baked into their regional plans and go through those kind of processes. We didn't, the county by county approach of the integrating committees didn't get us there. And I think there's a strong sense that a planful approach that creates a program that's funded for a period of time as to what that other bundle of infrastructure is and how it connects and relates to supporting and providing access to and from the transit system is something that the parties believe is an important element that's got to be developed.
Thank you. And before we move to our next presentation on transit-oriented development that expands the work to include housing and others, we have one more question from Andrew, and that is, have we considered surcharges for taxi and Uber, Lyft, rideshare rides to help fund the operational and improvement costs that we've been discussing? He notes some examples from Boston and New York City.
Yeah, and let me just follow up with the question with a little bit of a commentary behind this. So there has been some evidence-based studies done that demand for rideshare or for car services is kind of a zero-sum demand game with public transit. And so compounding on top of that, there is a philosophical debate that, rideshare is part of the transportation infrastructure, right? And so they should pay accordingly back into the system of operational costs within the entire design of the transit model. So that's kind of the background behind my question.
I think in terms of when we assess the potential sources of funding, obviously, when we look at the statute we just looked at for transit authorities, there was nothing like that articulated for transit systems. What I don't know for sure is whether the state law, and I don't know whether Bill or Greg has a sense, makes provisions for counties or cities to impose such a tax and for what purposes such a tax or fee could be charged. But I think it's definitely worth exploring.
Well, in general, and Greg can certainly supplement this, in general, cities have home rule authority. So they can, as long as they have the authority, they can levy what they want. But counties only get their authority derived from the Ohio Revised Code, and they don't have a specific ability, I don't think, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, to levy such a surcharge.
No, counties don't. And while the cities have home rule ability, the General Assembly, should they choose to, could preempt that ability. So to really have those sorts of fees be part of a sustainable funding model, my recommendation would be to seek approval for something like that through the General Assembly, which might be tough sledding these days, given the current political climate.
Yeah, and I would strongly encourage not conflating that with the technical amendment that we need at this point.
Right.
Excellent.
Can I ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Yes, Kumi, we'll take your question, and then if any other questions, please hold on to them. We wanted to ensure we get the TOD discussion as you requested as well. So, Kumi?
Just on the limitations, I saw that there's a development, I think a few slides back, there was a development limitation code it could not develop. I'm just curious, the Uber and Lyft, the private transit examples, just remind me that it seems like the public funded organization like a CODA that's duty is there for the public. It seems odd to put that type of restriction or to keep that type of restriction on CODA, particularly when there's going to be a material increase in value in the real estate, whether it's developed by CODA or not. Seems odd not to allow CODA to develop. Can someone speak about why that restriction remains?
I'll hand to Greg in a second. One thing I wanted to note on this was in a previous meeting, we had raised the issue of kind of value capture and are there ways to do that by virtue of this big investment, and found that there really aren't things specifically set up for that other than kind of assessment processes going forward on the value capture, right? I think one of the goals with the land assemblage here is a recognition that there's a long lead planning time to these corridors and the ability to kind of identify where key locations and stations are going to be and the kinds of development sites that will want to be around them. Frequently, they're very fragmented and they haven't been assembled in a way that they even can be developed by the private sector. So the notion that those could be brought together and the site being assembled on there is really the first major hurdle for these things to even be possible. With site control comes a lot of ability to influence the nature of that development going forward. And I'll let Greg speak to this. I'm assuming as landowner, there are aspects of that development other than being the developer that the landowner can do and participate in meaningful ways. But that's the thinking. Greg?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember the starting point here for these amendments. Right now, CODA does not have the ability to either assemble land or to develop transportation-oriented development. That's simply not part of CODA's statutory authorized purposes. So as we were thinking about these amendments and thinking about transit-oriented development, we had a lot of discussion around, what could we really articulate as CODA's best role in terms of transit-oriented development when we go and ask for these statutory amendments to broaden the CODA's authority here. And I think Terry did a good job of describing a lot of the discussions around how we thought CODA's best role would be in aggregating land over time for the future transit-oriented development, and not necessarily playing the role of developer. Certainly as landowner, you can influence it, but there's a big difference between being a land aggregator and then actually developing the property into transit-oriented development. So it's just a question of what we asked for and what we could really articulate as a good reason to the General Assembly for the expansion of these powers.
So as we think about that, I'd like to go back to the questions that Angel mentioned early in her presentation, and that is, we want to hear from you. How would you assess the region's willingness to support a sales tax of 0.5% for the implementation of the LinkUS program and these improvements that are critical to our community? And then what do you see as the major impediments or obstacles in securing such an increase? And we'd like to hear your thoughts in seeking a temporary versus permanent tax authorization. So you can raise your hands. Thank you, Yarma. I see your hand is up. We'll start with you.
Oh, thank you, Gail. I start with the last question. I believe for the taxpayers, permanent or temporary, I don't think will make a big difference. But for us, probably a permanent is critical. So I would push for critical. I mean, that's my opinion. I'm not an expert. I'm sure there are people who poll customers. I had a question and a comment. I want to make sure that sales taxes from online sales somehow arrive to the right destination. I mean, some time ago, as you know, online sales were not taxable unless there was a physical presence in the area. I think that's mostly it's changed in most of the states. I don't know what the status is in Ohio, but it would be very critical that online sales are taxed and that the quota taxes come to the county and not some pro rata to the population of the state, and we receive what we have, basically we are consuming. we get taxes from it. And the first question about the willingness to support, the tax or the impediments, it's really how we present it. It goes right to my very first comment. I mean, I think the benefits have to be shown in a way that relates to people's I get contribution to their happiness. I would be very happy off the record. I mean, and Kim already knows all this. I mean, how I look at it. I mean, there are specific benefits we need to identify, and we have to make sure that we contribute those benefits. It was not mentioned significantly, but the segregation is very important, because every job along those corridors becomes available to everyone on the corridor. That we are one of the most segregated cities. That might resonate with some of our customers. Finally, I have one comment, and I know that's a comment that's been made before. I don't remember the number now, but out of the 150 million we get, is complemented by maybe another 20 million of income from tickets purchases. I mean, what would be our chances to pass this if we said transit will be free? I mean, I know that's revolutionary here, but I mean, if we can tell you now 100% chance you're going to get the vote, but you might give up, $30 million of income a year, I mean, wouldn't we be better off? Because I think that might have a big psychological value in selling something like this. Or it might have a negative reaction. Maybe that's something we need to poll. I mean, Billy, to make sure that I'm not preaching the wrong thing,
I think it's really,
Good.
go. I don't know who's going to go ahead. Terry, was that you?
Go ahead,
Okay.
Angel.
I think that you bring up some very good points, Mr. Steiner. I think the first one is, I think we really need to be cautious when polling to just ask about free transit, because as we have looked at, it's not just a matter of lost revenue. There are additional expenses, significant additional expenses that come with that, and other consequences that need to be considered. So, of course, when polling, everybody wants everything for no cost. So I would just caution the poll to be very diligent about that, because there are some unintended consequences that have been demonstrated in other areas when you do have no fare to the population. One other point of clarification I just want to make is, in terms of the permanency or temporary nature of this, one of the things we will also be considering or asking for at the same time is making permanent that 0.25% that we currently have today. That is something, we would want to just do away with regardless. So just wanted to put that out there for the group.
This is Terry. Also, I was going to add would be if in fact that were baked into ballot language, obviously you'd lose the flexibility to be able to, if in fact you needed it or the policy didn't work, and very few cities have been able to make that policy work. But if it got baked in permanent, your ability to respond or start to provide that kind of service later, if deemed appropriate, would be very problematic. There's also concerns, even safety costs, policing costs and stuff, to what extent those get ramped up under some of these scenarios. We've looked at places like Cleveland where the system has to fund the entire transit police force on various kind of elements here that become really serious. So there's a lot of strong internal concerns, I think, with regard to what some of those impacts could be. But it's the kind of thing that continually gets evaluated.
What we'll do, any other questions or any other comments, any questions?
Can Billy or someone answer, is the sales tax on online sales will come to quota? That's what I'm curious.
So the breakdown of the sales tax is proportionate. The state gets their share, that regardless if it's online or if it's traditional retail, it's the same breakdown to whoever the sales tax is going to currently. So it doesn't much matter.
We asked for a breakdown on that, Yarmir, to understand, because Alex Fisher had asked how much of the sales tax comes from businesses versus residents and others. And we got a very complicated series of categories, state uses, and it doesn't really answer these questions for us clearly, because we were wondering how big those have become. On that front, we're continuing to try to dig into that to get our arms around exactly what portions of our revenue comes from those different segments. If we learn more, we'll certainly share it with this group.
Great. Thank you. So what we'll do is we'll share these questions with you in follow-up. If there's any other discussion around this, I'm not seeing any. Kathy, I see
Gail,
you
there
do
is
have
two hands.
Kathy.
There's Josh and
I
Kathy.
do see Kathy that you have your hand up, and I see now Josh, you do as well. So Kathy.
Yeah, I guess one of the main points that those of us in the Sierra Club were talking about regarding how to fund this is a sales tax is pretty regressive and it hits low income people the hardest. And those are the very people that use public transit. So I guess I'd want to see some sort of analysis as to how much extra would people be paying, especially lower income people and current transit riders. Would they be hit harder than everyone else? And I'd also want to see, like, have other forms of taxes been considered, such as an income tax that wouldn't be quite so regressive. So yeah, I guess that's just the main thing we talked about regarding taxes, is that a sales tax is considered a more regressive tax. And so just wanted to bring that up.
I think when the initial assessment of potential sources was looked at, and part of the summary that Roy and I prepared a meeting or two ago, part of the challenge was having something that lined up geographically with the Dakota service area on this. There's certain things a city could do or a county could do or various jurisdictions could do. County's main thing available was sales tax as well. So it hit kind of the same way on the front. And there is that challenge with sales tax. There's kind of no question about that kind of going forward. There are things to be done on the property tax front. There were a lot of issues that kind of came up with that as well. So I clearly think that's an important issue, and one for which, you know, we need to be able to indicate what's possible. Getting an entire new system of funding put in place for a transit entity we viewed as a major hurdle and be a big challenge from a statutory perspective at this point in time. The good news is the vast majority of these improvements are being made to serve those low-income neighborhoods in those urban areas on there. So whereas the cost is overwhelmingly disproportionate in terms of that regressive nature of the tax, the good news is the biggest portion of the improvements are serving those populations, going into those geographies and those areas. And the way the sales tax works here, it offsets our need to have rates and fees that are comparable to many other cities that are highly dependent on the fee structure on that. So we think it spreads it out significantly, keeps our user fees and rates quite low, and provides the overwhelming majority of the benefits to these geographic areas where low and moderate income residents, we think, will be primary beneficiaries of the services.
And Kathy, if I could just take a moment, I would be remiss if I didn't make a shameless plug for one of our newest improvements that we made at CODA is our new fare management system. And one of the key pieces of that, and one of the key reasons why we moved forward in that direction with our board support, was we are now able to have technology that allows fare capping. So those that can't afford the cost upfront of a day pass or a month-long pass can still receive the same benefit. And once they hit that point, they're not charged anymore. I say that because that's just the first step. We are continuing to look for ways in which we can better serve that community that really needs us. So I want to make sure that we're addressing what we're doing on an ongoing basis at CODA to serve those folks as well.
Thank you. Josh, we'll go to you, and then after Josh, I see Matt, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, as far as the answer to question number one, of course, my answer is going to be yes. That I think the community is going to support that. I think one of the things that, for those of you who haven't heard me say this over the years, you know, Transit Center, which is a national transit advocacy group, brought Transit Columbus to one of their conferences that they did. And the big takeaway for me there was if there's over 45% turnout in the election, the transit levy is likely to pass. So I think that we're making a really good move by going in November 2022. It's likely to be a high turnout election. It's likely that this, although very important to me, and I think everyone else on this call, will probably sink to the bottom for most people and is likely to pass if it's on the ballot. So yay, good for us. I think that's great. The permanent versus temporary, I think permanent is important because of the ability to do that bonding long term. I think that as, and this ties into why I think one of the things that I think we need to look at and pull around is, I think we need people to understand that this is a transformative investment in the community, and it is going to hopefully change the way our community, you know, is oriented, at least a percentage of it anyway. And that just because it's, you know, focused on BRT doesn't mean that it's not still as transformative, hopefully, as light rail. So I think we need to focus on that. I hope we can. And then I'll go back to what Jaromir said, and I've said in other meetings, the polling is extremely important because, you know, I think that we still don't really understand the language that we should be using in order to get the most votes that we possibly can. So I just want to stress, I know that that's in process, but I think the polling and polling why people say they want to vote for this is extremely important. I think that on the free transit, yes, our organization has been talking about polling around that specific issue since 2019. And we are agnostic on it, but, you know, if it's a winning issue, I think it's something to include. And if it's a losing issue, then, you know, let's not include it. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for that. And yes, the polling is very critical to this work. And Matt, I see you posted your comments in the chat. Would you like to expand on that?
I just wanted to kind of affirm both what Kathy and Jaromir said and kind of combine them to say that capturing online sales tax would likely be a way to make that more equitable. And I'm thinking of that just specifically in light of, you know, the ongoing work of the Franklin County Digital Equity Coalition. We know of those inequities. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. So we know there may be some more insights from you. We'll include these questions in our follow-up. And if you have anything else that you want to share, please send them our way. At this time, I'd like to move to our next discussion, and that is transit-oriented development. And so, Erin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gail. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys about some of the work that a few of us have been doing related to LinkUS and certainly more broadly, and really thinking about some of the questions that you guys have around the transit-oriented development component of LinkUS. And I think it's very clear to all of us that the transportation investment is a really transformational one. However, if the systems and infrastructure around the development surrounding that transportation investment are not where they need to be, then we run the risk of, best not capturing all the opportunities we can for our community, and at worst, exacerbating some of the issues that Columbus is facing right now, certainly relative to our growth and certainly relative to inequity. So I put this slide up. I don't believe there's anyone on this call that is not familiar with these statistics. But as we all know, Columbus is growing. And I think one of the key things to take away is that we are starting to feel the impacts of our growth and the lack of accommodation from a unit supply standpoint, and really understanding how we have that growth pattern in a way that accommodates our new neighbors and continues to allow Columbus to be a prosperous region for all our residents. And certainly as we look at the transportation investment, as we heard from our peer cities at the last meeting, making sure that that infrastructure around development is in place and ready to go is really critical. as you make that transportation investment. And I think what we have through the LinkUS lens is really thinking not just about how we accommodate transit-oriented development, but specifically how we consider it as equitable corridor development, right? And really understanding how best to unwind some of the inequities we have in the community, address some of the ways in which our land use policies and transportation investments in the past have led to those inequitable outcomes, and really understanding how we can work cross-jurisdictionally and amongst our partners throughout the region to address some of these issues. And so what we are working from is a framework. And I think, Kim, you can move on to the next slide if you're ready. Really starting to build a framework. And this is an ongoing conversation that we'll be having as the LinkUS process continues. Really thinking about the ways in which, when we have that transportation investment, that there are opportunities for our community and ways in which it can be detrimental to our community if we're not prepared. And we think about those being housing, jobs, and vitality. And when we look across those really key items of livability for our neighbors, we really want to think about how we can preserve, how we create, and how we include all of our neighbors as we make these large transportation investments. And this is a framework under which we'd be looking at our jurisdictional partners to identify ways in which there could be strategies to address each of these issues. And one of the challenges with LinkUS, obviously, is that we look across the region and we see very different corridors. From a development standpoint today, we certainly see multiple jurisdictions that are located along the transportation corridors. And so how we fit into this matrix in accommodating all of the different development patterns and jurisdictions and conditions that we have across the networks, then that'll be how we develop strategies that are really effective in the given condition that they are in. You know, we'd certainly look at the Northwest Corridor as being a largely built out corridor with a really strong job component to it. Those strategies are going to be different than what we need to address along East Main or West Broad, thinking across preserve, creating, and including all of our partners. So as we continue to do the LinkUS work, we'll be looking at our jurisdictional partners, including the City of Columbus, to identify where those strategies are in each of these categories along the corridors that are included in their jurisdictions. And you can go to the next slide, Kim. And so, for example, as I've also got Kevin Wheeler on the call with me here, he is our Assistant Director of Growth Strategy. And so when we talk about that matrix and we talk about jurisdictions identifying strategies that are in line with each of those corridors, I look at the work that the City of Columbus is doing in our Department of Development and some of the initiatives that we're undertaking. While they have a more broad role in the community beyond the transit corridors, it is part of our work to focus in on our strategies and make sure that they are, certainly in the more immediate term, looking at those transit corridors and making sure that the strategies are putting our systems in place to accommodate that transportation infrastructure. And so, Kevin, will you take just a quick minute to talk about the zoning code update specific in that how we are addressing the equitable corridor development framework in the City of Columbus? I think Kevin's
Sure. Thank you, Erin. I think many of you have been in this meeting when I've spoken about the zoning code previously. And so you're aware that the city is moving to update its code. We, in October, wrapped up what we call phase one, which was a third-party assessment of our current code and process. And really, there was no surprise there. The code has a lot of challenges. It's not supporting affordable housing and transit in the way that we want it to. It's not doing those things equitably. There are a lot of challenges with respect to access to the code. It's confusing, it's complicated, it's not user-friendly. And really most importantly, it's just not positioned for where we're trying to go as a city in terms of in the future, a city that's going to be, we believe, becoming denser as we grow up more than out, a city that is going to embrace the opportunity to really reinvest in our key corridors and some of our commercial centers that are going to evolve from what they have been in the last couple decades, we believe, to more of a mixed use activity center kind of format. So beginning in 2022, we're currently initiating the RFP process to bring on board consultant assistance, staffing up for it, we're going to begin the update process. One of the early priorities will be mixed use corridors and specifically transit supported strategies. So, you know, if you've ever been through zoning work, code update work, you know, this is a fairly deliberative process. This is a comprehensive update to our code. And certainly LinkUS and the connection to LinkUS and the connection between land use and transit and therefore zoning and transit is critical, and we understand that. But we do have to go through a pretty deliberate process, particularly one that focuses on engaging our constituents, our residents. And as we do that work, one of the things that we're very motivated by is the realization that, you know, these kinds of processes typically have not reached the broad spectrum of our community that we need to. So there are segments of the community constituencies that have typically been absent from these conversations. African-American residents, lower income residents, renters, for instance, have not been represented in proportionate ways. And so one of the things that you'll hear from us in 2022 moving on is a real emphasis on engagement, even as we look at the sort of the technical work that we need to do to update the code. So again, comprehensive update, early focus on mixed use and transit corridors, ongoing robust engagement with an emphasis on equitable outreach. That's going to characterize the effort for the next few years. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, Aaron and I will do our best. Thanks.
And then just a quick update, just, you know, as we think about, again, executing a platform around which this transit investment happens, the housing strategy is going to be incredibly important, and the work that I get to do in this new role as Director of Housing Strategies and working with all of our partners, as we think about that transportation and investment, we're going to need to be very deliberate about including affordable housing. And by affordable, I mean below the 80% of area median income. That will take deliberate and intentional effort to add those affordable units into the transportation corridors. We're going to need to be deliberate about preservation of existing affordability along the corridors and really thinking very specifically about the anti-displacement strategies that we deploy along the corridors, tenant protections, homeowners resources and abilities to support our low-income homeowners, so that those folks that are living along the corridors can continue to benefit from that investment. We're going to need to include everyone in this conversation. This is going to be a regional conversation about how we provide equitable access to housing throughout all our communities. And then working, you know, alongside with Kevin and the zoning code to make sure that we keep pace of our supply with our housing, with our population growth, so that we look at the corridors as places where we can really make a lot of that density and supply happen in a meaningful way with the support of the transit infrastructure. And then I think the last thing I'll say is we have another partner in the development department as we kind of look strategically across these systems, specifically within the city of Columbus, and that's Quentin Harris, who's our Deputy Director for Economic Development, and thinking, you know, forward in the 21st century about how we do economic development and what that looks like, especially on these transit corridors. Thinking again about creating opportunities for jobs and making sure that our residents are connected to those jobs, but also thinking about, you know, the preservation of our existing small businesses along the corridor, and thinking about other amenities and services, grocery stores, other kinds of opportunities that we need along the corridors that may or may not naturally occur, but may need some support from the city, and really thinking about what that fabric looks like from an economic development standpoint as well. And again, this is an ongoing conversation. We are, you know, each jurisdiction is going to need to participate in the conversation, but really building the framework under LinkUS as that preserve, create, and include priorities and focus on equitable corridor development, so that we have the opportunity to really leverage the transportation investment to support all the residents throughout the region.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Any questions for Aaron or Kevin?
Actually, Gail, I do have a quick question. First of all, Aaron and Kevin, awesome job. And thank you for what you just presented to us. In regards to the equitable aspect that we're taking a look at, when we think about Black-owned businesses and entrepreneurs, and you think about vendors specifically for a project of this magnitude, when we speak of, I think 22 billion was the top number that I heard, are there any intentional plans to ensure that from an equity standpoint that we actually have diverse vendors that are a part of this particular project, especially where there may be lanes that we may not have ownership in those businesses now, but by the time the project is full blown, we would have people who have the qualifications, even as subs, to be a part of this project and not miss out on this opportunity equitably.
I think that's a really good question. Kim, I don't know if that's something, relative as far as vendors and part of the construction project, if that's something you can answer from the CODA side.
I can share that we have minimum DEI requirements in our procurement processes, and those are being evaluated. We talk about them across teams as we start to actually share contracts and working on, right now we're in preliminary design and working on this together. At all levels, we have minimum DEI requirements, and we can discuss that and share that with the group and discuss further.
Thank you for that. I would definitely recommend, similar to some of the same sentiments that Yarmir shared from the beginning on the first call, is that as we think about this from an equitable perspective, this right here is a major component of how we should be taking a look at it as well from a vendor perspective. And even with those requirements that are in place, I think we know that there's still disparities there in regards to where things stand and how we can help close that gap. I think this could be a great first step in helping to do that from a long-term sustainable perspective, because that's going to also impact job creation. So just something to share while we have the opportunity.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for your question and your comments. Very important. Any other questions? If I may make a comment on the equitable and inclusion, I know for the LinkUS engagement from a communications perspective, there's diverse vendors that have been engaged to support that, Kevin, from the LinkUS to the corridor work as well. So I just didn't want to leave that on the table as part of your question. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Gail. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. So if there are no more questions or comments, we will certainly follow up, and we do understand we want to get some more clarification on a tax distribution method, and we'll get that to you as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to William, who will share our next steps and close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. And more importantly, thanks to everybody who presented today, and all of you for the questions, the dialogue, the engagement, the feedback. Seeing the level of engagement and the types of questions, really heartening. This is important work, and making sure we're hearing everything from how does this affect housing to equity to development, and how are we being sensitive about who the transit serves, and being mindful of this. I'm really impressed with the discussion today. So thank you everybody for that. As we think about next steps, as we're heading into 2022, there's a lot of significant work that's going to take place. And this is going to happen as we're bringing the planning phase of the LinkUS Leadership Coalition to a close. So there's one more meeting scheduled for this work. It's going to be on January 18th at the same time of day, and it will be virtual. So there should be an invitation from the team to get it on your calendar here soon. And while our planning meetings are coming to an end, the advocacy and education efforts are going to continue. So we're going to continue to call on you to support awareness efforts, and you're going to hear more about that via email. From a technical work perspective, the East-West Corridors project and the Northwest Corridor project are going to continue, and the teams are going to move on that work. There are beginning meetings and technical planning associated with the efforts. There's also going to be more public engagement for those specific corridors, which is really critical as we're moving from planning into technical work. MORPC with CODA and the city are also working with our communications team to connect outreach to our regional partners and get their insights and their feedback as we're planning this work. You know that MORPC works with 75 communities around the region, so this is something we love to do and are so excited to be a part of, because we know LinkUS is not just a project in one area of town, it's something that affects the whole region. And that's why we know it won't be successful unless our suburban partners, our cities, our townships are all plugged into this. We've already met with the technical leaders of our region, and now we're reaching out and getting meetings on the books so that in January, we'll have really specific outreach and conversations with leaders in our suburbs and our townships. So there's a lot more happening in that realm. Tomorrow, representatives from each of the partners, the LinkUS communications team leaders, and the communication leaders for each of the corridors are going to have a strategic communications session. They're going to be looking back at the year and the accomplishments, mapping out the strategy and milestones for 2022 and beyond. And we're going to give you a full update on their work at the next meeting of this steering committee in January. I told you there's a lot going on. There's more. We're also going to continue to explore the TOD and what and how partners on this call and others can collaborate on when it comes to housing or other types of planning work. And finally, as Mandy at the beginning outlined for us regarding the LinkUS Leadership Coalition Summary Report, you are going to receive communications very soon to review that report so that we can finalize it and incorporate those last questions and feedback and capture all the work we've done as a committee and all the information and questions and the follow-up we need to do from today's discussion. So this is a really robust effort. We're really excited as we turn into 2022 and really appreciate your time and your involvement and your questions. Keep them coming. We can't get this done unless we do it together, and you've been a really important part of that. So Gail, I think that's everything on our next steps. It's a robust plan for next year. And so with that, I think we can go ahead and adjourn. Thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you in the new year. Thanks again.
Thank you, William. Thank you.